Hello, we are live here with SCI TV. I'm Joshua Gordon, the founder of the Sports Conflict Institute. Today I am joined by Torre Chisholm, the Athletic Director of Portland State University, and Dr. Ken Pendleton from the Sports Conflict Institute. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, Josh.
So, Torre, our hope is that you can give a little introduction about who you are, how you got into your role as Athletic Director, and then our hope is to spend our time talking about what is often a topic that folks don't enjoy a whole lot, which is risk management in sports. And let's figure out what that all means and where we go from there.
Well, sure. It all started a while ago for me. I was attending school at UC Santa Barbara. Of all things, while I was in school, I ended up being an assistant coach for the women's volleyball team. I have a background in playing volleyball. My parents were both coaches, and really that just from there developed into the administrative role, working tickets, marketing, development, game operations. I was at Santa Barbara between school and work a total of 13 years. I had a chance to move on to the University of California, Irvine as an associate athletic director, where I oversaw fundraising, marketing, pretty much all external operations. I had a chance to do a lot of really neat projects, both construction and events. And then in 2007, I was blessed with the opportunity to come to Portland and be the athletic director at Portland State University. I've been here since then, and I've loved the work, and so that brings me up to date. I'm actually leaving this position fairly shortly for a return back to California, get back closer to family. But it's been a great ride at Portland State, and really have had a chance to learn a lot of things. I mean, when you're an athletic director at a FCS school, you have your hands in everything. So I've had a chance to really be engaged with every aspect of intercollegiate athletics program.
So your program's had a lot of success in your realm there, and obviously you got your start in part of the fun part where you started coaching and those types of things. But as an athletic director, you have to be involved in a lot of the other issues as well, and in particular risk management. And what do we mean by risk management when you're thinking about it from your perspective?
Well, I tell you what, it's really encompassing. We are student-athlete service-driven. So first and foremost, risk management means doing everything we can to protect the best interest of our student-athletes. But there's certainly also a university perspective to it, risk management, and doing what you need to do to minimize issues that arise out of NCAA compliance, issues that arise from liability circumstances, whether it relates to it could be relate to injury or other problems that might arise. So risk management has really become an all-encompassing activity, and in today's role as an athletic director is probably more relevant than it's ever been. And I can't tell you the reasons why. Is it because society is more litigious? Is it because there's more social media and things that maybe weren't seen before are seen now? Maybe there's just more scrutiny on athletics in general. But for whatever reason, an athletic director finds himself dealing with risk management issues a substantially greater percentage of their time than probably ever they have before.
Now, you're speaking from the perspective of an FCS school. Most of the publicity about risk management that goes especially to the national media is about FBS schools. I wonder what is the difference between what are the differences between the challenges those two types of schools face, or would you say it's mostly the same? They have mostly the same challenges.
Well, I'm admittedly going to give you a biased opinion when I say this, but the difference does sometimes come down to money. If you're at an FCS program or lower, maybe a 3A program, you could be at a Division II program. You have to protect your student athletes. You have to protect your university at the same level of expectation that you would if you're an FBS program. Chances are you're doing it with a lot fewer resources and a lot fewer protections. Now, the one thing that FBS programs do have to deal with is a much greater media scrutiny. Okay, so if they have a problem, it's much more likely to garner local, national media attention and potentially a balloon from there. So maybe the visibility and the stakes might seem a little bit different, but once again, you got to keep in mind you don't do risk management so that you can frankly cover your butt, for lack of a better term. You do risk management because you have a responsibility to take care of your student athletes. to the best of your ability.
So how do you go about it? And certainly there's some ongoing things that you must have put in place, but what has been the evolution for you in terms of running your athletic department and trying to figure out what the right things to be doing are from a risk management perspective?
Well, I think you have to break it down into a couple different components. Obviously, we talked a little bit about NCAA compliance. It is vital for every institution in the NCAA to have a very professional compliance program. And that also, the big component now of that is compliance education. Because frankly, a compliance officer can't manage the whole thing. Compliance has to be a shared culture and responsibility amongst every member of your athletic staff and frankly amongst your student athletes. So you've seen a real advent in the need and importance of having a good compliance program, but even more than that, having a really good compliance education program where your compliance directors are constantly communicating with coaches, staff, and student athletes to let them know about updates in the rules, let them know about the nuances, different things that, sometimes maybe aren't intrinsic common knowledge. So that's certainly a big piece of it, and that's on the compliance side. I think if you look at some of the other issues around risk management, frankly, what I've discovered in my work at Portland State is you have to be willing to work with the specialists that you have on campus. I mean, every school is going to have a director of risk management. They're going to obviously most likely have a general counsel staff inside the university. Historically, athletics, by its own nature, but also sometimes by the university nature, because they isolate themselves. You can't afford to do that in today's culture. Today, to avoid the big problems that arise, you have to be in constant communication with the experts on your campus to make sure that you're vetting concepts or things that you're doing, or if you're making policy changes, that you vet those policy changes through those folks so that they can bring a perspective that's a little bit outside of athletics, but they can also help create kind of a checks and balance process for you as an athletic director.
Well, one of the stereotypes about athletic departments is that they're very insular, that they essentially want to be separated from the university, but what you're saying is the opposite. In order to be successful in terms of risk management, you have to find a way to really work with all the resources available. Do you find that you have to fight an insular culture within, or tendency towards insular culture within your program, or do you it was very natural for most of the athletic department to want to work with the rest of the university?
No, frankly, it's not a part of the culture of athletics. You're right. Historically, athletics has been very insular at most institutions, and become islands. And as I said before, that's really not just all about how athletics is doing. It's also sometimes about how the university views it, because the athletic enterprise, in many regards, for so long, has been fundamentally different than the academic enterprise in the way it needs to operate and function. Now, I will say this. With the increased funding that you're seeing across the country of public funding for higher education, most schools are actually starting to become increasingly entrepreneurial in a number of areas. So all of a sudden now the way that athletics has operated historically for a number of years is actually becoming a little bit more commonplace elsewhere on campus. So actually we're in a position now where campuses are better able to understand what athletics is doing and how they operate. But what an athletics program has to do today is they have to embrace what the university is willing to offer. And sometimes they don't like doing that because sometimes you're right, we want to control our own, our own activities. But in doing so, you just greatly enhance the risk to the program, you enhance the risk to your student athletes. And once again, that's counterproductive to what we're trying to do.
So for you, what are the types of risks that keep you up at night? Some of the risks obviously are more mature, things like facilities management and making sure that those environments are safe and all of that. But then you have things like social networking and reputational risk that are much more new age concerns that we don't always have great answers to. What are the things for you that when you're putting your head on the pillow that keep you from really falling into that deep sleep that you probably need and deserve?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, the number one thing you always worry about is the safety of your student athletes, and making sure that, especially if we have football here, so when you're especially sponsoring football or frankly any sport, you want to make sure that you have a program in place that meets the needs of your student athletes effectively. So that's something you're always worried about. The things that probably keep you up at night is the elements of the risk management that you don't feel like you necessarily can control. The reality is young people are going to be young people. They're going to make some poor decisions, especially in the middle of the night. Unfortunately, a lot of those decisions might be related to alcohol, and you don't necessarily know what you're doing. You have 300 student athletes, and I'm in an urban environment. I mean, there's a lot of influences on them, so you worry about those sort of things, and then you worry about those things from the perspective of the care of the student athlete, but you also worry about it from the protection of the university's image. And so how do you address those? And the other thing is you look at today's climate in terms of how you protect the university has become much trickier. I've told the story many times before. I mean, frankly, back before my perspective, back before the Duke lacrosse case, it was pretty easy to decide how you deal with the student-athlete issue. You protect the university, you suspend the student-athlete, and then you move forward from there. Ever since that case came across, and it was ended up being a fabricated circumstance, and then those players turned around and were able to file a lawsuit against Duke. Now it really illuminated the fact that you have to look at this in a completely different way. I mean, you want to protect the university, but you also have to be cognizant of the rights of the student athletes in case there's, something that's not right about the circumstance. So it's really complicated how we approach how we protect the university. And I feel for a lot of my fellow athletic directors who find themselves in these circumstances when they get in a position where, frankly, they want to take an action, but they can't take an action because that would violate the rights the student athlete has as well. And so, I mean, that's why I'm saying part of it is to be able to consult with the folks on campus. You definitely need to have the legal advice. You definitely need to have the advice of your risk management as you address some of these issues. But yeah, at the end of the night, the thing that keeps any athletic director up is 300 student athletes who, there's a public perception that you are able to control whatever they're doing, when in reality, that doesn't exist.
Right. So I'm just curious, given the complexity of what you have to manage, which I doubt you really envisioned when you first started being an assistant volleyball coach back at UCSB, is there formal training that athletic directors, assistant athletic directors receive in conflict management and in negotiation, mediation, these kind of skills, or do you just have to learn on the go?
Well, there's actually been a growth, and you probably both know. I mean, there's certainly been a growth in the advent in sports management programs at academic institutions over the last 20 years. So there's certainly outlets that way. There has been a growth in really specialized kind of like institutes that aspiring athletic directors can get engaged with, that you can learn the basics. But yeah, in terms of the actual doing it, you learn that through experience. Now, I would say one thing you look at, it's really interesting, it's a challenge in our field right now, is you look at most hires of athletic directors, especially at the Division I level, and they mostly revolve around a school's perception that it needs to generate revenue. That's my background. I was a marketing and a fundraiser. And you look at a vast majority of hires, that's where the background of that individual is going to be. But then when you get onto the campus setting, you're put in a position where you're having to deal with all these other issues that maybe you haven't had a lot of exposure to. Once again, just goes back to what I said earlier. That's why an AD has to be willing to partner with campus on those things. Because there's a pretty good chance if your background's development, you haven't had a lot of exposure to a lot of the risk management components.
What have you found in terms of structurally things that are useful to help mitigate some of the risk that you've identified? And some of the things we're talking about are even where do you house your student athletes? How are they integrated into the rest of the university? Some of those things we've found can make a big difference in terms of checks and balances.
Well, yeah, there's certainly so many of those things that you can look at. I think at the athletic level, it really starts first and foremost. You have to make sure that you're updating your policy manual, your student-athlete handbook, so that everybody understands the way that you're operating. Especially important because athletics, in terms of staff and coaches, is a very transitory work environment. You're going to have a lot of people come and go. And so how do you build continuity of care and risk management between coaching staffs or administrators. So policy manuals are becoming increasingly important. Frankly, in lawsuit settings, they're becoming vital pieces of evidence, and you're seeing that growth across the country. So you have to look at some of those elements. I think some of the other stuff that you have to look at is how do you hit it right on the head. How do you really integrate your student athletes in the greater collegiate experience? And that's one of the things that we're proud of, that we feel like we've done a pretty good job here. We don't isolate where we house our student athletes. We spread them out amongst their fellow students across campus in the various dorms. We don't necessarily have a training table set up, so they're going to eat at places where they're going to have interaction with other students. And so there's a handful of things that you try to do to integrate them in the university. But in terms of the greater risk management piece, it really is focusing on your internal controls and then your partnerships with campus. I'm getting a little redundant on the partnerships with campus, but frankly, I can't stress it enough. I'm a prime example. I would tell you my first probably 3 or 4 years here, I might have undervalued that. My last 4 years here, I cannot stress enough the importance of it.
Well, I think that's really, it's really encouraging that you were able to get your athletic department culture and you in particular to sort of switch the mindset, get out of that insular mindset. One of the other, one of the things we see when we see controversies with the FBS schools is that a lot of them often revolve around high-risk athletes. So a public story will come out about a problem that an athlete caused, and we'll often find out there were clearly signs of risk factors apparent before that person was recruited.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that occurs much less often at the FCS level. But that aside, to the extent it does occur, you mentioned that resources are what you don't have that the FBS schools have. What steps do you take with high-risk athletes that you do recruit?
Well, I mean, we have a pretty elaborate procedure for the evaluation of what you might consider to be high-risk student athletes before they come in, and that procedure requires coaches to take a lot of personal responsibility for their management. So you try to tackle it as much as you can up front. But even with that evaluation process, or even with the evaluation of student athletes who you don't really deem to be high risk, once again, you have 300 student athletes in our place, and a lot of institutions with many more than that. A certain percentage of them, just like a certain percentage of the general student body population, are going to run into issues or have some problems or make poor decisions. And so then how do you address and deal with it? If you're in an FCS school or you're a 3A school, you might have the fortune that it's a little bit more anonymous than it would be in an FBS program, but it's still an issue that has to deal with. One of the things that's really important for us here is, we let our student athletes know that there's no special treatment. So if they run into a problem, whether it's a conflict with another student somewhere on campus, they're going to go through the same disciplinary process that any student would go through. And they're not going to necessarily get, and then on top of that, not only going to have to deal with that discipline, then they're going to get a secondary basic discipline probably from their coach or from the athletic department itself. So I think that piece of it is really important at any place, that your students first. And you might be an athlete, you might be high profile, but we have to treat you just like we would treat any other student.
So Torre, one of the hot button topics that has been on the mind of a lot of folks has been the idea of bullying and then also hazing. Bullying could be from one student athlete to another. It could also be coach behavior. Hazing more about the idea of these are the rituals of initiation to be on a team. How have you dealt with those issues that often are rooted deeply in history and tradition at a university? What have you done, proactively as a department to try and mitigate and prevent those types of behaviors?
Well, I'd say fortunately, we've never had issues with hazing that we've experienced at Portland State, and I'd say part of it might be the nature of the type of student that's attracted to Portland State, but also some of it is the nature of hazing, and especially bullying is one thing that society really has tackled in a very aggressive way And I do think you're seeing a decrease of it at the high school level, which then translates over to the college level. So certainly I think that's part of it. The other piece is just constant communication to coaches and student athletes about hazing and the inappropriateness of it. It's interesting. I would tell you one of the things that it's been an interesting subset of that, and it's something to monitor, at athletic programs moving forward, is that another big component of success in athletics really deals with what you call senior leadership. So having your experienced players really be leaders for your younger players. And I would say this, one thing with the advent and growth of the awareness of bullying, we have had a couple issues over the years that we've had to look at where, there was a concern that was that senior leadership, does that translate in one way into hazing or bullying, or is it done in an appropriate manner? So that's actually kind of the pendulum swinging the other way. It's something that athletic directors at all institutions are just going to have to keep an eye on down the road.
I mean, it's interesting to me that one of the things about saying, look, you're going to be treated like the other students and demanding senior leadership is I think you could make a case that the FCS schools actually teach a lot more of the values that sports is supposed to promote, especially in terms of sort of leadership and responsibility, than you're going to get at an FBS school if you live in a football-only dorm, only eat with fellow athletes, and much of what you do is actually controlled. Your time is actually micromanaged. Yeah. And so I feel like that's one of the you're sort of really you're able to create a more empowering environment for what your student athletes are going to learn during their 4 years. Their 4 years at Portland State.
Well, and I'd like to say that's by design, but the reality is part of it's by finances. I mean, I can't honestly tell you that if FCS programs had the resources that FBS programs didn't, then we wouldn't necessarily be encountering some of the same issues. I would say one thing that we deal with, we see more, or at the FCS level, is that student athletes here are predominantly coming to school for the right reasons. They're using sports as a way to get an education. Obviously when you're dealing with a lot of high-profile athletes who have a chance at a professional career in sports, frankly, the reality is they're using education as a way to do their sport. And the nuance, it's small, but it is significant. Now that said, you look at any program. It's really 1% of your student athletes who have an outlet for a professional sports career. Even at where you guys are, University of Oregon, but 99% of the students there are actually looking to do it. They're going to school to get an education. The hard part now is the drive to win, and the drive to be competitive is becoming so overpowering that there's more and more demands on student athletes, and that's why you're even seeing as part of the restructuring of the FBS, they're starting to look at if they need to implement some greater controls around what could really be expected time-wise of student athletes.
So, Torre, one of the roles that's important on a lot of campuses in general in dealing with conflict is the role of an ombudsperson. And at Portland State, you have one of the more robust ombuds programs out there. And yet, at least from our experience, very few ombuds folk have been successful in finding their way into athletic departments and being useful and valuable to those folks. I'm curious if that's been any different for you, and if it hasn't, what advice would you have for ombuds folk about how to better integrate and support your department?
What's really funny is actually we have not had much engagement with that office at Portland State. At previous institutions I have, and successfully so. I think what you do tend to see in athletics, and this is what we've kind of put in place here, is we actually brought someone on who was actually a volunteer position, retired faculty member, but had been a former student athlete, to actually work in an ombudsman role within athletics. Because one thing that we do experience is we talked a little bit about the isolation of athletics. It is reasonable to say that sometimes your student athletes feel more comfortable talking about problems and issues with an individual who they feel has experienced what they're going through. And that's why if you have a chance to kind of like create your own, I it doesn't have to be a dedicated office. It could be someone within your staff who also serves that role, who has experience as a student athlete. That's really an important aspect because, right or wrong, it does provide a greater comfort level to a student athlete with an issue.
Do you find that the student athletes are really willing to go to that person on a regular basis?
I've had that experience here since we brought the person on board. I mean, and the whole key to it is to have that person with a reporting relationship that isn't beholden to anybody other than maybe the athletic director. But what makes it really important is, like, within an athletic program, you have a lot of people who support student athletes. You have coaches, you have sports medicine staff, you have academic advisors, and then you might have others. But if you look at a coach, the athlete is responsible to the coach for their effort as it relates to athletics. If you look at your academic advisor, the athlete's responsible to the academic advisor with regards to their efforts in academics. So those people still have a power differential that maybe they're willing to talk to those individuals about things not within their power differential, but sometimes they're not. So creating someone who's completely out of that side of that power dynamic, it really creates, my experience is that it creates a nice tool, for a student athlete who's looking for some help and guidance.
Great. And so as we start to wrap the conversation, and you've offered an awful lot in terms of insights into how to handle some of the risk that you deal with as an athletic director, any final thoughts you want to add? And again, our audience is a mix of other athletic directors and supporters and athletes and just folks interested in sports.
Well, I mean, it's a good topic you guys bring up. It's a topic that athletic directors everywhere have to be very aware of. As I said, sometimes our background isn't in this particular area of expertise, but we have to seek it out. But we also have to be willing to acknowledge that we're not going to be specialists in it. We have to be open to trusting to work with specialists to make sure that we do the best for our programs and best for our student athletes. So yeah, it's a vital topic, and it's only going to become increasingly more important down the road.
Well, Torre, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise on this. It's really great thoughts and a lot to think about, and certainly these types of insights and conversation go a long way towards helping other people understand what they're walking into when they go into different roles in the sports management and the sports industry. So thank you again.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys having me on, and great work you guys do sharing this information with folks who are working every day for the betterment of student athletes.